Alright, this is video 10, and this is our last set of notes. We've got a lot of labs to do, to kind of putting it all together, that we'll talk about surface water and the impact of man and human activity on the quality of the water. So we're going to begin by looking at the definition of water pollution, which is when any substance that's added to water that can have a negative effect on the water itself and the living things in the water. And the amount of potable water, which means it's available and clean enough to drink, is going to depend on the quality of the water. And so water quality is a measure of how healthy the water is. Can it support living things? Is it have a low enough quality of chemicals that can still be used for drinking water? Water pollution includes a lot of different things. Treated wastewater, so even when man tries to make it better, that it still has to go back in there. You never can get the water back to as clean as it was before it was used. Runoff, because when you have excess rain and water runs off and runs to downhill, it picks up anything that is left behind on the surface, and that would include roadways and sidewalks as well as the soil. Toxic chemicals have been buried and dumped in our waterways. They've been buried underground and leaked into our waterways. Municipal sewage, even though it's treated, sometimes those pipes rupture and we can have raw sewage going into our water. Cars leave behind motor oil and gasoline. We had a recent winter storm, so there's a lot of excess salt and brine solution that was on the roads that will run off into our streams. Fertilizers, detergents, pesticides, all these are different types of chemicals that can end up in our water. When waste is deposited in the water, the solid particles are always going to settle to the bottom, and then the chemical gets diluted by the water. Water naturally can renew itself through the water cycle and filtering itself through wetland environments. However, sometimes we get too much nutrient waste in the water, and nutrient waste is any waste that is high in nitrates and phosphates. And these are two common ingredients in commercial fertilizers, as well as animal poop and human poop. And these act like a nutrient or a natural fertilizer for algae that are in the water, and their growth can become uncontrollable. And you may have ridden down the road and seen a lake or a pond or a stream that looks rather green, and this green scum that covers the surface is occurred because there are too much nitrates and or phosphates in the water, and the algae has grown uncontrollably and kind of taken over the surface, and it chokes out oxygen from being able to enter the water for the fish, and thus with less dissolved oxygen, fish kills can occur. So here is a diagram of this process. You often hear these areas called hypoxic, which means there is a lack of dissolved oxygen in the water. Sediment pollution is the #1 cause of water pollution in North Carolina rivers. And we'll pause for a moment and talk about what may have caused this causes this sediment runoff, and what would or why this sediment runoff can harm water quality. Another term is effluent, which describes any waste material that's discharged in the environment. So we've talked about two different examples of water pollution in our notes so far. We've talked about when you have nutrient pollution, which is when you get too many nitrates and phosphates in the water, and sediment pollution, when you get too much soil particles in the water and the water becomes very cloudy. So those would be two different examples. But effluent could be any pollutant or waste material that's been discharged in the environment. And we'll watch the two video clips at the end of your notes. Now, when you are tracking the cause of water pollution, it can be very difficult. Point source pollution can be traced to its point of origin. You actually have somebody to point the finger at or blame. It could be a pipe, it could be a smokestack, it could be a culvert, which is just an open pipe draining into a stream or a river. It could be an underground container that's pouring or leaking. You've got some type of waste going into a body of water, and if you track back that waste, you can trace it back to this smokestack or pipe or culvert or barrel, and then usually you can trace it back to its owner. So that would be point source pollution. However, the majority of pollution is going to be very hard to trace it back to a single point of origin. Cars leak exhaust, engines leak oil, the winter storm. Nobody's going to know. We're all to blame for those type of pollution. A boat, instead of bringing its sewage tank in after a day on the river, waits to dusk when no one's looking and pours it in the river. Who's going to ever know that they did that? We have 4 days of rain in rural North Carolina, and several ponds, which were collecting ponds for animal waste, livestock waste, overflow, and that waste gets in. Are you going to find out which farmer's poop shows up downstream 20 miles? So non-point source pollution. So it's very hard to find somebody to blame in non-point source pollution. Another critical issue when you're talking about pollution is you're talking about biomagnification. When any chemical enters the environment through the water, it can get into the food chain. Our first level producers, the plants, or the plant-like organisms that act as producers, absorb the chemical, and then the first level consumers eat the producer, and they eat more and they get more and more of this chemical trapped in their cells. And at each level of the food chain, more of the chemical is absorbed and the impact on the organism is magnified. So the top level organism is most affected, so it magnifies the effect on the living thing the higher up you go. So in this case, DDT, you can look at the different parts per million. So in the water itself, there was not that much. We're talking very little for every part water. Then as the phytoplankton absorb that water, we get to there's 4/100ths DDT for every part per million. Then the zooplankton, and we're now at a half a part per million. Then the small fish, their tissue holds onto it, and the large fish. Finally, you get to the shorebirds, and in their tissue, there are 25 parts per million of DDT. And DDT was used in the 40s and the early 50s as it was going to be the pesticide that would keep all of our crops safe. It went to market. Everybody thought it was wonderful. And then a scientist named Rachel Carson began noticing that the birds' populations were decreasing. And she began studying and found out that DDT magnified in the food chain. And as it magnified in the food chain, it affected the reproductive organs of your top level consumers, your birds like osprey and eagles. And many birds became endangered, some became extinct. The eagle was on the endangered species list. It has made a comeback. DDT ended up being banned because of this effect of biomagnification. Now, if you want to find out how clean the water is, what its water quality is, first thing to look for is living organisms. The macroinvertebrates, which would be small insects and amphibians, they're macro, they can be seen by the naked eye, but they're invertebrates, they're still very small. But many of them are pollution intolerant. And if their population is very small or non-existent, then we know that the water has been polluted. So doing a population count when you are looking at studying a body of water is very important. Dissolved oxygen. With so many marine organisms having gills for respiration, they must have a steady supply of dissolved oxygen in the water. So if the DO is low, then you know that the water is not healthy enough to support marine life. Phosphates and nitrates we mentioned are chemicals that cause nutrient pollution, and they act as fertilizer to the algae populations, leading to excess growth, and eventually they can lead to fish kills. Temperature, most marine organisms have an ideal temperature range. However, if you've got too much of certain chemicals, the water can heat up. There's also thermal pollution that can occur when heated wastewater is just dumped back into a body of water. Turbidity happens with things like sediment pollution and runoff, heavy runoff, but it's a measure of how transparent the water is. Water is going to become less and less transparent due to the presence of a lot of particles dumping into it, like soil and sediment. If you never notice water that looks kind of rusty, you've probably got a lot of red clay going in it. Turbidity, if water is highly turbid, that means there's a lot of runoff coming in, carrying a lot of sediment particles or suspended particles. It buries your bottom dwellers, so it can upset stream beds where eggs have been buried. It can make finding food more difficult. It can make the penetration of sunlight for photosynthesis more difficult because it does create this cloudiness. pH would tell you if the water is an acid or a base. So if you've got too much other material going into the water that could create an acidic or an alkaline environment, which neither one would, again, be good for marine life or anyone that is wanting to use it as drinking water. So that is where we are going to end our last water video, and then we're going to begin a series of labs in the next few days.